have a couple of times I'll stop and ask for questions or comments. And that's the way we like to do it here anyway. For anybody who's new on one of our webinars, we do appreciate comments and questions in the chat. The way George and I look at it is we are facilitators of information. We know that the people who join us also are experts in many different areas, and we always appreciate when people share their expertise with the group. So tonight, what happened was we had said we were going to do a persuasion webinar tonight, and I started researching it, and I realized when I was looking through George Lakoff's work and other people's work, I realized that so much of what we're talking about in framing and persuasion is a lot of it was just the basics of good communication. And I thought, wow, well, that's a lot. There's a lot that goes into the basics of good communication and communicating to persuade. And then there's the whole framing and persuasion. So we're doing them in two separate things. If everybody could mute. You can unmute if you want to ask a question or make a comment. Please, don't feel you have to stay on mute the entire time. So as we move forward, like George said, our part 2 of persuasion is going to be on January 10th, if you wanted to sign up for that. Then we'll be going much deeper into the framing and persuasion. But right now, I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to be doing a PowerPoint presentation. And you can see that persuasion, communicate for results. Okay. So having problems with the forwarding. So when we think about communication or persuading, I pulled up the definition of persuade is to cause someone to do something by asking, arguing, or giving reasons, or to cause someone to believe something. That's the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition. Sounds easy, doesn't it? Like that's no problem. But we know communication is a very complex thing. And even though we do it every day, we don't realize all the complexity often that goes into effective communication. I also just want to make sure that we differentiate this from manipulation. We are not here to manipulate. We want to communicate and persuade with integrity. And manipulation is to play upon by artful, unfair, or insidious means, especially to one's own advantage. Basically, to trick somebody into doing something you want them to do. That's not what we're all about. We're all about communicating with integrity and persuading with integrity. So the way I look at this is persuasion is the art of communicating with someone to get them to take an action you desire that also meets their needs. That's what I think. That's what I think of as persuasion. So to start, I'm going to just talk about communication, and I'm going to put up a chart here. And the chart, without me knowing what your screen is on your end, this chart could be really tough to read. So I sent it in advance. And if you saw my Eventbrite email from this morning, it had the chart in it because I thought if you could see, if you wanted to print it out and look at it that way. Also, I am going to pop it right now. I think it should, let me see here. I got to get it in the, I'm going to pop it into the chat in case you want to look at it. There's a link to that. So, all right, why isn't this forwarding? My apologies. Trying to get this to forward. There we go. Okay, so this is something that I call, this is called the sender-receiver model of communication. And this actually was developed by Bell and Howell in 1948. And it was really about the communication feedback or the radio wave feedback in radios. And then over the years, people started using it to talk about a communication loop. And so what I did then is I took it and added a few more things to it. And I've used this in a number of presentations that I've done on communication over the last number of decades. So what I'm going to do first is talk about the top graphic. And what you've got there is it shows the sender encodes a message through a channel that goes to a receiver who then decodes that message. And then that loop, if you're in a feedback loop, if you're in a type of communication where you can get feedback, like a one-on-one communication, then that loop backs and the receiver becomes the sender and it goes back through that loop. Now let's look at each one of those shapes up there and talk about them. Okay, so the sender, and let's just say it for this, you are the sender. So the sender you have a perspective on life. You have a way of being, and it's all informed by the language you speak, your culture, your race, your gender, your economic status, your education level, your age, your geographical location, your political orientation. So all of those things go into making up who you are and have an impact on your communication. Now, the sender is going to transmit a message, and that's encoding a message. And so the success for a successful encoding or transmission of a message is dependent upon the sender's ability to convey information clearly and simply, but also on the ability to anticipate and eliminate sources of confusion. So if at all possible, know your audience and know who you're talking to. That will help to eliminate some of those sources of confusion. So right now I'm going to pass over the channel because we're going to get to that. I'm going to go to the receiver end of that communication. And the receiver, just like the sender, is an individual human being that has a perspective on life that is made up by all of the things that that are made up in the sender, the language, the culture, the gender, your education level, et cetera, et cetera. All these things make up who you are and affect your how you are going to receive a message. And so now the receiver decodes the message. And the process of decoding is how is the person going to understand the message? So there are a number of factors that go into this. Some of these factors are controlled by the receiver and some are controlled by the sender. So factors that can affect accurate decoding of a message are the person's just not listening, or they're just sort of half listening and they're checking their text or doing other things. Contrary to popular belief, people cannot multitask. You really can only do one thing at a time effectively. So if you're trying to listen to somebody, you're not going to be successful if you're on your phone or if you're texting with people, et cetera, et cetera. Language barriers. That is also this little story that I have. A few years ago, George and I were in London. And our first morning there, we went to order a coffee. Now we're in London, they speak English, I speak English. So they're all English words. And I say to the barista at the coffee shop, it's sort of like a Starbucks. I say to the barista, I'd like an Americano with room for cream. And then George ordered a latte. Well, shortly after that, his latte comes out. And then a whole bunch of other orders come out for other people, and they never sent out my Americano with room for cream. So I went up to the counter and I asked them, you'd think maybe the Americano would be the hard part of that. No, that's not the problem. The problem is that they did not understand what I meant by room for cream. They could not understand it. We were talking at each other like this. I could not make them understand what room for cream meant, even though they're all English words. They're speaking English. I'm speaking English. They have cream there. That's something that they have. But there was a language communication barrier there, and I could not I finally got my coffee. Don't worry about it, but I got my coffee. So another thing that can affect a decoding of a message is if the message is too complicated. If it, like, for instance, let's look at Neil deGrasse Tyson. I'm sure when he is speaking at an astrophysics convention, he speaks in one way. He speaks very, I'm sure, very complex, very deep into astrophysics. But if he's on the Stephen Colbert show, he is using plain, simple language that everybody can understand. And that's why people like him so much, because he can take very complex issues and make them very simple to understand. So that's when you're transmitting a message, you need to think about that. Is it too complicated? Is it too boring? Because think about like your tone of voice and things like that. There's a lot of things that can go into making your message too boring. So think about that. Your words and your body language are incongruent. That causes like people in their head, they say like, what's happening here? Her words sound really nice, but she sounds very angry. I can't understand what she's saying. I can't figure out what she's trying to tell me. And then putting a person into what we call defense mode. And I'm going to talk about that later. That's very important when it comes to persuasion. So now let's look at our channels. You've got two different ways you can communicate, either verbally or written. So let's look at the verbal communication. You've got your face-to-face communication, or you could say one-to-one. And that's you could get a really good feedback loop going with that. Like a meeting, like one to several, like a meeting that is such that anybody, could participate in the meeting. That like usually less than 10 people. Or there's public speaking, where that's one to many. And this is almost like public speaking. This is sort of like halfway between a meeting and public speaking, because you will get a chance to speak. In all of those, you can bring all of yourself to that communication. And what I mean by that is you can use your words, you can use your tone of voice, and you can use your body language in all three of those. Obviously, your face-to-face is where you're going to get the best feedback. And public speaking, depending on how many people are in the crowd, you're going to get the least amount of feedback from that, but you can still get feedback when you are in person with people. Zoom has changed some of this a little bit, and I'm not going to go into a great deal about that. Zoom has become sort of, during our pandemic, Zoom has become like a stand-in for in-person types of things. So they're sort of like they're in person, but then there's that whole technology piece that does put a bit of a barrier there. Now let's look at a telephone. That's another channel of communication. And I don't mean like FaceTime where you can see somebody. I mean really just talking on the phone. Well, obviously I'm sorry. I keep hitting, I'm at George's station and I keep hitting things that I'm not used to. So I'm sorry, I moved it. Okay.
As long as you don't hit me, I'm okay.
Yeah, well, you're too far away.
Oh, okay.
So at any rate, so on the telephone, obviously, one of the things you're going to start losing when you're on the telephone is you're going to lose the ability to use your body language to convey a message. Now you've only got your words and your tone of voice. So you've lost a piece of that, but you still have a great feedback loop that you can get. You can get the receiver to then transmit a message back to you. Then there's video, which would be like television, YouTube, TikTok, those kinds of things. You again can bring all parts of you, your words, your tone of voice, your body language, but you start to lose that feedback ability. You're not getting immediate feedback from that communication. And then for audio, same thing about the feedback. Like if you're looking at radio or podcasts or things of that nature, you've also lost your body language. Now, when you get into written communication, now, of course, you are just using your words and you've lost your tone of voice, you've lost your body language. And as we looked at that, look at text messaging. I think text messaging probably gives, in the written communication, gives you the best feedback, where you're going to get immediate feedback to your communication, to your message. Email, you can still has really great opportunities for feedback, but it may be a little bit more delayed. Social media, you may or may not get feedback on social media. Usually you do get some feedback, and depending on how you're using that, if you are using that to persuade, how, and you can respond to that feedback too, but it's not generally in real time. And then when you get down to things like newsletters, magazines, and books, your words really have to do all the work there, because your opportunities for feedback are extremely delayed or non-existent. And with letters to the editor, I didn't put that up there, but letters to the editor, of course, there's something that we use a lot in political work. And you can get some feedback. You may get some feedback on your letter to the editor in the form of either somebody you know sees it and they email you, or maybe there would be another letter to the editor either rebutting or agreeing with your letter in the next like a week later in the next edition of the like your local newspaper. So those are so to recap this, and this is, like I said, the basics of communication. The sender encodes a message through a channel to the receiver, who then decodes that message. So before I move on, that was a lot of information I poured on you guys right now. Are there any questions or anything, or comments or anything about this? And feel free to unmute or put them in the chat. Okay, hearing none right now. I'm going to move on then. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is we're going to start getting more into persuasion and communicating to persuade.
Oh, excuse me, this is Connie Bogan. I have had technical problems and making a comment. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay, great. So, so one of my issues is, what about the situation, very common now, where the person you're communicating with has been bombarded with right-wing propaganda full of lies and misinformation, and they can't hear what you're saying, because everything you say is getting filtered through those lies and misinformation.
That's a really, really good point. And that starts to come into what we're going to be talking about a little bit about, is somebody actually at this point in time persuadable? And depending on when you want them to do something and what your goal is for your persuasion. How about if I talk to this we do this next part, and then let's see if there's more specific questions that you have regarding that. And I'll go through this little mnemonic that I have right now to talk about communicating to persuade. Maybe some of your questions will be answered, but if they're not, please feel free to come back in again and let's talk a little bit more. So I'm going to use the mnemonic of who, what, when, where, how, and why. That's something we've all learned. We learned it in high school. It's used in good reporting to hit all of those things in your message. So I'm using this to think about, when we're persuading, what are we doing, and how is this working? So first, let's go to the who. Who is your audience? And sometimes you don't know who your audience is. Like if you're writing a letter to the editor, your audience is just everybody who would be happening to read that. But sometimes you do know who your audience is. And one of the things to really think about, is that person persuadable? Are they so deep into their beliefs that there's no way that they can be persuaded to come over to your side, or at least not anytime soon? It's not to say that they could never, but could they do it anytime soon? And what would they, I'm sorry here, let me just get this over here. Yeah, so that's what you need to think about. Or are they already on your side of an issue, and now you're trying to persuade them to take a specific action? Is it a single person, a small group of people? Is it millions of people because you're on TV talking to millions of people? So that's what you need to think about. Who is your audience? How much can you narrow it down? How much do you know who you're talking to? Sometimes you can't know who you're talking to, but if you do, then it's something to think about. Then, all right, let me see here. Again, my apologies. Okay. And now be very clear on this. What do you want them to think or believe about an issue? And what or what action do you want them to take? I know that seems so obvious, but I'll just talk for myself. I know sometimes I go into these things and then I'm not really exactly sure what I want somebody to do, or I'm not exactly sure what I actually believe about that, or what I actually know about something. So it's very important that you're really super clear on that, so you can then tell people what it is you want, so they understand what it is you want from them. When does the action need to take place? If you need somebody, if you want somebody to go out, let's say the example of, I want to get people to go out and vote for Joe Biden in the election. This was obviously in 2020. And the election's coming up in a couple of weeks. So the when is also going to determine who you're going to talk to. If the very specific action you need somebody to do is coming up very quickly, you don't have a whole bunch of time to get them to bring them over to your beliefs. You need to pretty much be talking to somebody you think are already pretty much on your side, believe what you do, and then try to get them to take that action. So I'm sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. I put something, George is just telling me. Okay.
Just close the Acrobat.
Yes, I accidentally put something over the screen. So George told me, sorry about that.
She's doing good for her first time.
Yeah. So when does the action need to take place? So you need to think about that. Or if really what you're trying to do is change somebody's worldview, that could take months or years. But that's okay. Then you can start now, and then you can start talking to them about things if you're not needing them to do something immediately. So you need to think about when you want that action to take place. And where is the communication taking place? Is it on somebody's doorstep? Are you door knocking? So just get into your head where this is happening. Are you doing this on social media? So then you can start thinking about how you need to craft your message. What kind of feedback are you going to be able to get with this message, depending on where you are. If you're at a doorstep talking one-on-one with somebody, you're going to be able to get feedback from them. If you are writing a letter to the editor, you won't be able to get feedback, and you really need to start thinking, you really need to craft your words and that kind of thing. So think about where this communication is taking place. And how are you communicating? Is that verbally or in writing? And we already talked about that when we talked about the channels of communication, and where you can, where your tone of voice and your body language come in. So think about that, how you are going to communicate to somebody. And then this is the last one, and it's the most important one, is why do you care about this issue? And put that first, because if you can't articulate why you care about something, you are never going to be able to persuade somebody else to care about it too. You have to be very, very clear about why you care. And this is, a number of you have been on other of our webinars. And if you haven't, we do talk about this in framing and effective messages. So George and I talk about this all the time. Anybody who's been on here on our webinars before, know we talk about the why. People need to understand why you value something. What about a certain topic? What about an action? Why do you value that? What values does it highlight in you? And then that way you can maybe touch on somebody else's values. So that is the who, what, when, where, how, and why. Just thinking about, as you're crafting your messages, all of those things. Who are you talking to? What do you want them to do? When does this action need to take place? Where is this taking place? How are you doing it? And most importantly, why do you care about this? So before I move forward, Are there any questions or comments? Or Connie, did that answer anything for you, or do you have more questions?
Maybe I wrote a few things down on Connie's question.
Okay.
And and Connie's question again was, what about basically the pylon that we get from the GOP, the kind of barrage of messages that are often lies and distractions, anything to keep the general level of controversy right out there in front of everybody. And so you were wondering, what do you do about that? First off, this is on purpose. This particular style of communicating has been around for a while. The last administration didn't invent it, and it had been around back in the 30s and at other times in history. The idea is to keep people confused about what the truth is by constantly putting a lot of lies, a lot of misdirection, a lot of questioning about things that are actually true. And so there's that. It's also, this is meant to confuse people. It's also meant to keep us off our message. That's a huge effect that it has, because they know that in general, we're more likely to say, well, no, that's not true. And then we'll list a bunch of facts that prove it. And they really don't care if we do that. They like it, because what happens then is we're keeping the controversy alive. We've let them set the agenda about what's talked about. We're speaking from within their frames. And then we also are off our message. And that's really what they want. The more time we spend arguing with them, the less time we talk about our message. So one of the best things you can do in the face of that kind of confusion is to just go back to our message. I'll send a link out when we find the follow-up email. Send a link out. There's an interesting video of Representative Maloney, who I think is I'll get it wrong. I don't know if he's House Whip or not, but he's talking with Joe Scarborough, who nowadays is a pretty, normal guy, but he is not going to use a couple of words that Joe Scarborough thinks he ought to use. And he does everything he can not to say those words, and succeeds. And it's worth watching. And then Hobie noted that, remember that it's not that he had seen Marilyn Carlson speak, and she was a perfect example of people who won't remember what you said, but they will remember how you made them feel. That's really important. That goes back to the people won't care about what you're advocating for until they know why you care. Always a good thing to do. And then Isla Ray mentioned tips to know who is persuadable and who isn't. That is really interesting. I don't know if you're going to get into that more next time.
We could talk about that. One of the things is sometimes you won't know going in, but I think, I guess I'm going to be talking a little bit about defensive mode and then listening for understanding. That's coming up next. And those are some of the things you can do. Listening for understanding. If you don't know the person and you start to listen to what they're saying, really listening to them, and I'll go into that. Like sometimes you're just not going to know who's persuadable until you start talking to them.
Thanks. I imagine what's coming is going to make a big difference for me. I'll just quickly mention that I took a series of communications classes called Bridging the Divide, Communicating in Troubled Times, where one of the first principles, this was after the 2016 election, and one of the basic principles I remember is that it's important to understand, if you're a progressive, that you have been demonized very effectively, starting with Rush Limbaugh. So you will be perceived in a way that closes people to your who you are and your ideas, and you have to find a way of dealing with that. And I haven't found that way yet, but I'm hoping that I will gain some of that insight tonight and in future classes. And I guess that's all I need to say about that.
All right, thank you, Connie.
And note that Don mentioned in the comments, it's important to realize that people on the right think the same way about people on the left, that the other group is brainwashed and telling lies. And that is certainly true. And not that we're brainwashed and telling lies, but that's what people think. And there is we have one advantage in that our particular viewpoint aligns more with reality more often. And so there's that. But yeah, it is important to realize that when you're talking to somebody else, they're coming at it from that very well orchestrated, very well burnt in idea about who we are. Republicans have been way better at defining who we are than we are defining them.
And if I might weigh in for just a minute on this too, and they've been doing it a lot, and we haven't been doing it a lot ourselves. We've been letting them lead the band here, and we need to step up and say there's an alternative message rather than, like you talked about, always responding to them. So they lead and then we follow up after that. We need to get our message out there and keep hammering away, but also learn about what they've done. I'll give you a quick example. This is a great book if you haven't read it, Dismantling Democracy by Donald Cohen. I'll write it in the chat too. About the 50 years or the 40 years the right has been doing it, like was mentioned, Rush Limbaugh and those people. They've been working at it a long time. And a lot, sadly, what's happening in our country, it's bearing fruit for them in the courts, in the state legislatures, in CRT stuff. That's all a master plan to take over and control things in lots of different directions. And we need to say there's a different message out there, and here it is, but we need to get it out there, and we have to train people like we're doing now to say our message and not repeat their message and not argue against theirs so it gets repeated.
Exactly. And like to just again, when you're talking about persuasion, is what do you want to have happen? So again, thinking of that, if what you want is that you want to start changing people's worldview, then you've got time. You're not asking somebody to do something next week. You're trying to so putting your messages out there constantly, leading with your why and that kind of thing can start to change people's minds if we get out in front of it. Like Murray said, we have to get out in front of it though, and not always be behind and always reacting to what other people are saying.
Lisa, it's Hobie. I like, the model that you've got. I'm just not sure that the title is one that I would pick, because I've said this before, that I believe in attraction rather than persuasion. We are attracted to buy Teslas because they are cool, not because they have 10 cup holders. If I start the conversation by talking about persuasion, I think as liberals, we fall into the trap of then thinking that we should be able to convince someone as opposed to attract someone to what our core values are. And so I think it's a frame against communication. And I mean, I would rather talk about the principles of attraction rather than the principles of persuasion, because it's too easy for us as liberals to kind of go into the, let me give you the top 3 reasons. As a matter of fact, the right has, framed it back, that tendency back as, the woke culture, or, Democrats are trying to tell you what to do or control you in that sense. And so the best way to do that, I think, is through a good story.
Well, that's true. That's absolutely true, Hobie. And using stories in whatever communication you're doing, whether it is to persuade, but a story is what would attract people. Also, putting your values out there is what can attract people as well. If you share values with somebody, you can always have a values conversation. So that can attract people over to your side as well by sharing your values. I'm just going to go into the next thing I'm going to go into here is something that I call defensive mode. And it's not, I don't, just me, you can look this up online and you'll see different articles about this. But when you're trying to persuade somebody, the last thing you want them to do is shut down. They need to be able to hear what you're saying. So defensive mode happens in the receiver when a message triggers a sense of threat or an unwanted feeling. And these feelings are around are shame and guilt and anger, or feeling stupid, or challenges what they already believe, like Connie had asked before, or like some other people have talked about. If somebody has some very strongly held beliefs and you come in with another set of beliefs, they're going to go into what they call defensive mode, or what we call defensive mode. And when you think about it, it's like a flight, or it's the flight or fight response. It's the same thing that happens if you're walking through the forest and you see a grizzly bear. Your brain and different parts of your body start to shut down, because it's all going to the essential parts of your body that are going to either be able to get you out of there quickly or to fight. And that happens even when the threat isn't physical. If somebody experiences one of these feelings, or multiples of these types of feelings, then they're going to go into a flight or flight response. They can no longer hear your message. And if they can't hear your message, you cannot persuade them. So you want to stay out of that. You don't want people to go into defensive mode if you can possibly help it. Things you can do to prevent that from happening are watch the words you say. And this, especially in verbal communication, but also in written communication. You want to use words. You want it to be very clear. You want it to be simple. You don't want it to be overly complicated, because if you start using jargon and sound overly academic, or you can make people feel stupid, and then they go into defensive mode. If you start using accusatory language, that puts people right in defensive mode. When you're talking with people or writing, don't ever use like you should, or you always talk about it in terms of yourself. Well, this is how I feel. This is what I would do. This is who I'm voting for. Won't you join me? That kind of thing. Instead of saying, because you should, put somebody in a defensive mode. Oh, I should I? Well, what if I don't want to? It's just the way people are. And of course, watch your tone of voice. Don't sound condescending. Don't sound angry. And watch your body language. Keep it relaxed, keep it loose, and watch your proximity to other people. Do not enter into their personal space. And you can tell if you are. Everybody has a different level of what their personal space is. You can tell if you're entering somebody's personal space, because they'll be backing up and they'll be doing something. Lori, do you have a question?
Yes. I can give a good example. I have a friend who grew up in a family that was very, very right wing, and her views were very black and white, especially with this topic that comes up every voting season, and a lot of people vote on that topic only on that side of the line. And I said, it isn't always black and white. There's a lot of gray. And I started telling stories that I was told by my grandmother, who became good friends with a nurse when they moved to the cities. I told stories about a woman who died with her eighth child, and left all her children behind because she didn't have a choice. And they grew up without their mother, and the town had to help the father. I told her about women who have died from health issues, who haven't had a choice. And I just shared stories. And by sharing stories, rather than saying you're wrong or saying I'm right, I gave her the choice to make her own decision on sharing real life stories, and how rich women could go to Europe and poor women couldn't. And by sharing these stories, she made a complete reverse, became liberal to support women's rights. And that I found throughout my life, and with a lot of what I've been through, is by sharing real life stories, personal stories, is the best way to influence and persuade people.
Thank you, Lori. You know, I want to tell everybody, this is Lori's first webinar, Lori's in my Toastmasters club, and a very, very good communicator. And this is her first Connections Lab workshop or webinar. And you get it, Lori, you already get it. And I think that kind of what you said talks to about what Hobie said about you're attracting somebody to come over to your side by telling your stories. I think you've now attracted, you attract them rather than telling them what they should do. You've attracted somebody over to your side. That's a really good example. So, yeah, so when you're thinking of your, you know, about putting people in defense, well, you do not want to do that. And sometimes that's hard. That's hard to do. And especially if you are in one-on-one communication with somebody, like say at the door, like you're door knocking. And keep in mind, when you are in a one-on-one conversation with somebody, if you put them into defensive mode, they are likely to respond back to you in a way that puts you in a defensive mode. And unless you, and I know there are people who can really rise above this. I am not one of them. I know I go into defensive mode when people say certain things. I can be triggered. And if that happens and you can't rise above it and you realize this conversation is going nowhere, then remove yourself from it. And if you're at the door, then just thank you for your time, sir. I'll let you move on with your day. Or if you're with a friend or whatever, you can change the subject. You can say, I can see right now we're not on the same wavelength. Maybe we should just talk about something else and we can revisit this at another time. But it doesn't, if you want to persuade somebody, it doesn't help or doesn't move you forward at all if you are in defensive mode and you're not hearing each other. Then if you're not hearing each other, no persuasion is happening and it's just time to move on. Any questions or comments about that?
There are a couple of things in the chat, and I would just know, Leaf mentions, has Nextdoor been an effective path for attracting and educating or building public support? I'm not sure. I've been on Nextdoor in our town, and I found that when I do stray into political matters, I get a ton of blowback. People go, there's people bringing politics into this community thing again. So I don't know. That could just be the ornery people where I live. So I don't know an answer to that question.
Yeah, Nextdoor. Is there anybody who has a good Nextdoor experience? I mean, it's so local that it's probably really influenced by who is in Nextdoor. So has anybody had an experience with Nextdoor? Leaf?
Yeah, the reason why I bring it up is because at a very local level, here in New York City, we've been trying to advocate or trying to, we've been concerned about urban policy with putting outdoor dining on the streets in the residential districts, and it's really changed the neighborhoods. And one of the struggles has been, I mean, in a place like this, which is, it can be very chaotic to anybody from coming outside to look into New York City. It's pretty nutty here compared to most other urban centers. But one of the difficulties is just understanding if you have actually a supportive, if there's a supportive community around you, even though you think you know your community. We've lived here for 30 years and we think we know our neighborhood. Well, guess what? We don't really recognize our neighborhood anymore. And it's contentious stuff. And particularly in light of COVID conditions, some of these are pandemic era emergency measures to allow people to eat and still be socially distant and stuff like that. But they're trying to make it permanent because economically it's become a huge engine. So Nextdoor became a way to just express some of the feelings and just the actual, literally some of the conditions to throw it out there. And yeah, I get that. So once you start to go political on Nextdoor, you kind of get shut down pretty quickly, either with people who are actually really upset that you're doing something political on it, or by people who are actually watching it, including the moderators, to say, oh, you know, you're crossing over a line here. That's not really sort of the Nextdoor thing. But what we've found is that when you engage with people at a very local level and just share your actual experience through a photograph or a video clip of what's actually happening outside your front door, it's pretty interesting what happens. As long as you observe a lot of the rules that you're advocating on here, as long as you maintain that, you know, about not engaging in negativity, watching your words, all of these things, and your tone and things like that, and not allowing yourself to be baited too. It's pretty amazing. We found here that you know, a conversation starts to develop and it gets bigger and bigger. And what I'm finding on Nextdoor is that it doesn't take that much for it to be a fairly dominating conversation. As long as it's along a certain thread, which is about the personal experience, people start to weigh in. And it doesn't take a lot of hits for it to be right up on the main feed, and other neighborhoods start to chime in on it. And you do start to get a sense of just how, you know, and people, what I find is that they're not really that well informed. And that's one of the biggest problems, is they don't realize that something's coming down the pike as we speak, and they think it's temporary or it's not really a thing. So I found it pretty useful for getting kind of mobilizing people who have a similar feeling or are interested or are kind of waking up to the problem. And then when people do get on there that are really on the opposite side, because there's always the opposite side, the ones you would wish you could persuade or attract to your view, some people are just not going to have it. They have some other agenda. But I found also quite a few people under a lot of very misinformed. And when they hear a lot of other people chiming in and kind of finding a common ground, then you start to see some support coming from it. So I think it can be a useful tool if it's used right and you don't expect too much from it.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Yeah, that sounds like, if I were to summarize, you said keeping with personal experience, also using local stories, personal stories.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just to the other talker person's point, you know, sharing your personal story is very compelling to people, even when they're not necessarily naturally in agreement on what, you know, the politics of it. They relate to that.
I also have to say, it's pretty amazing. You've been there 30 years and haven't picked up the accent. I'm from New York and it took me a while to get rid of it.
Well, you know, I see one other thing up here, Hobie put, social media tends to exacerbate differences rather than bridge them. And that's, I'm going to go into
But I like Leaf's approach.
What?
I like Leaf's
Oh
approach.
yeah, me too. We have 5 minutes left, and I always like to at least end the presentation on time in case anybody has to leave. But as you know, if anybody's been on before, we always stay to answer questions and talk for a little while afterwards. But I do want to make sure I get through the entire presentation, because I think this next thing is really important, in that we need to really, and this is where I think like things like social media and communication channels that don't allow for immediate feedback probably aren't the best for persuasion. They're good for getting your ideas out there. People can read them and think about them and things like that. But to persuade, or to really, okay, there we go. All right, I'm just going to put this up here. I'm sorry, my PowerPoint isn't working very well tonight. So what I want to talk about briefly before we leave is listening to understand. And we talk about listening, right? People, you listen, right? But really what most people are doing when they say they're listening, or when they think they're listening, they're sort of half listening. You're thinking about what you're going to make for dinner tonight. You're thinking about taking the dog to the vet or other things. Is it going to rain tomorrow? That kind of thing while somebody else is talking. And what really happens a lot is when other people are talking, what often people are doing is listening, and they're thinking about what they're going to say next. And anytime you're thinking about something else and not laser focused on what the person is saying, you're going to miss things. So listening to understand puts people at ease. People can certainly tell if you're really listening to them or not. And also what that does is it helps you respond to them in a way that addresses their needs. If you're really understanding where they're coming from, if you're really picking up on what their values are and that kind of thing, then you, when you do transmit your message back to them, you can address those things. So listening to understand is so important. And I think when we're talking about persuasion, because persuasion is really communication with just that extra hurdle that you're trying to get somebody to do something, whether it's to take an action or change their viewpoint on something. You're trying to get them to do something. You really need to listen to them. So probably your best channel for persuasion is more one-on-one as you can get, or more opportunities that you get for feedback on your message will help you to then persuade. And like what Hobie said, like social media, it's probably not great, because what it does is it kind of can push people apart. People just respond to things on social media. They may agree with you, they may not agree with you. Even if you can respond to what somebody's saying, it's not in real time. And it sort of can feel like a ganging up and that kind of thing. So I feel the best way to persuade somebody is if you can get them into a more one-on-one type conversation, or at least something where there is an opportunity for feedback. So I'm just going to close this off so we can get done by 8 o'clock. Anybody who needs to leave can leave, but we always stick around for questions. So what we talked about tonight was the sender-receiver model of communication. We talked about the who, what, when, where, how, and why when you're thinking about persuading. Talked about not triggering a defensive mode and listening for understanding. And those are the basics of good communication. And there's certainly more than that. That's just a real quick primer on the basics of good communication. And the next time we're going to talk about framing and persuasion. So having said that, I want to thank you all for coming, but please stick around, ask questions, let's talk if you've got the time. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask or any comments they'd like to make?
Thank you very much, first of all.
Oh, thank you. Did you pop on? Did Liz give you the link? Liz Keefe in here?
For Leif and Kathy?
Yeah.
Leslie Clark, right?
Right.
Leslie Clark
Okay.
had introduced us to what you folks are doing. So
Cool.
I'm really glad. It's been really interesting because we've never took part in anything like this, but we've been involved in this effort, in this coalition building effort here in New York City now for the better part of a year, right?
Yeah.
About a year, and it's really been quite a journey. And so a lot of these things I recognize that we've come to the hard way. There really are. It's really great to see this. Thank you.
Well, Liz went off, but next time, look for her. It's always nice to connect people who live near each other.
Yeah.
See what's going on. The more community, it's all organizing is community. So more community we can make, the better things get.
It's interesting about the personal, experience part of it, because even in social media, we've been finding that, as long as you've got something that's really a fundamental truth, like your experience, this is what you see and then sometimes the conversation that comes from that, it's almost more important who's around it, listening and watching that you're reaching in some way. And
yeah,
that's
true. Sometimes your audience is not the person you're arguing with, but everybody who's listening to both of you.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And I like that idea of strategic messaging and framing, which goes along kind of with what we were getting into in the next door argument, where this is what I call the magic bumper sticker versus, long-term framing. The magic bumper sticker is, some people believe that somehow if we can just get the right 3 words fit on a bumper sticker, then somebody's going to see it and flip their worldview. And, it doesn't often, if ever, happen that way. But this idea, setting our sights, I mean, what do we call success in this? Do we call success that we turned this person today, that we got them to vote for somebody? We have various things that we're after, but it doesn't seem often that what we're looking to do is plant a seed and plant another seed and another seed over a long period of time, which is exactly what the GOP did. I will give them this: for a party that seems to relish in science denial, the one bit of science area that they did not deny is psychology. They studied it very carefully, and so they know it well. But they've been doing what we ought to be doing, and that's planting those seeds. So if you have a conversation with somebody over the holidays in your family who's not of the same persuasion as we are, so to speak, it's okay if you move them 1 inch rather than a mile. And if we do that with everybody all the time, people start to have an idea of where we're coming and what we're inviting them to take on it. As Hobie says, we're attracting them, and we're doing it a little bit by a little bit. Nothing wrong with that.
I would say, and thank you, Hobie, for saying that, bringing that up, because I do like that way of thinking about it. And it's going to get me to think a little bit differently about this, about the attraction piece and bringing people along through our stories and through the sharing of our values and that kind of thing.
I should also point out, if you haven't been there, Hobie's website, Hobie's pretty much an expert in the environment but also in framing, and I highly recommend his website, skywaterearth.com. It's Hobie's a rather mighty smart and a wise guy. well worth the read.
Great. Thank you. Check it out.
Yeah.
Thanks, George.
Yep. And
Any other?
Lisa, I just have, is there another question out there? I'm
No,
sorry.
go ahead, Ginny.
go ahead, Ginny.
Oh, just a personal story of my brother-in-law and I were at his mother's 90th birthday party a few years ago. And I don't know how the conversation started going that way, but he started talking about how he hated Democrats. And I was just like shocked. I mean, because on my fridge, I've got Hillary, I've got all these, I mean, I don't know how he could not have known. And I looked at him and I said, oh my gosh. I said, well, I'm a Democrat. You must hate me then. And he goes, what? And it was just like, I couldn't believe it. It was like I was from Mars or something. And anyway, and he was saying, oh, I hate Mark Dayton and I hate this and I hate that. And, and I I said, oh my gosh. I said, well, I like Mark Dayton. But it was really crazy. Cause I mean, at the end of the night, I just said, well, Rob, I love you anyway. And he couldn't even speak to me. He got in his car and drove away. Yeah. It took months for us to actually be able to kind of communicate. And I don't think a relationship has ever really kind of gotten back to where it was. So it was really crazy. It just blew my mind. And his daughters and his wife were like, Rob, it's your mother's birthday. Quiet, please, quiet. And he just was going off the beam. So anyway, it's just an interesting thing about how, we were really in that defensive mode. It was terrible. So.
It's interesting to me about that story too, is that it's like he's so deeply embedded in his own belief system that he can't even imagine that somebody that I'm sure he cares about you, somebody that he's known for decades probably, that he can't even conceive that you might think differently than him. Like
Yeah,
it never occurred to him that you would. Isn't that
and
interesting?
you know, we've had so many family parties, and I have, you know, Democrat stuff all over the fridge, and crazy Trump cartoons when he was, oh, now I've taken him down, but you know, I mean, just I mean, and just I mean, I don't know how he could not have known, because they were plastered all over the fridge, you know, with magnets and stuff. But anyway, just kind of interesting, because when you were talking about that, I was like, oh my gosh. I mean, and I've been trying to figure out how I can try to, you know, but I've got my work cut out for me with him for sure. Thank you very much. This was interesting.
So what's interesting is there is a physiological, neurological part of this, that if people who have, and this is all of us, this is every human, humans have these issues. And once ideas are in somebody's head and they're repeated and repeated, and these beliefs have been held for a very long time, the brain is always going to go, it's going to take the path of least resistance. Yeah, I mean, unless you specifically say, I'm going to put myself into a logical, scientific reasoning mode, the brain normally just goes down the path of least resistance to what it knows best, the thing it's experienced the most. Obviously, there's survival benefits to that way back in our lizard brain, but this, you know, that's why it is really people. And again, this is all humans. Once people are into one way of looking at the world, it's very, very hard to get them out of that. It's not impossible. I have personally met two people who were as hard right as it gets. One person did websites for militia groups out west, completely flipped their worldview. So it's not impossible. And I want to get your hopes up that what we're going to do here is going to cause that to happen everywhere we go. But it's interesting to know how the brain works. And the advantage of framing is that people in our culture they are aware of the frames of the other side. They just don't attach those frames to politics. They'll use them in other parts of their life. Like you might find somebody who's a real nurturing parent at home, but who's a tyrant at work, or vice versa. People, but you know, they apply one value in one situation and a different value in the other. So our idea is to attract people over to the values that we have, invite them to try these on, tell a story that puts our frame onto a story that illuminates something political, and that opens the door a bit. I'll also add a link to a couple of articles. One is from a conservative website. The other one is from the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. And they're both about how to have conversations with people, with your relatives at Thanksgiving. And I don't think it will come as a great surprise that the conservative one is quite excellent. Actually, it's well worth the read. If you just change the examples, it works well for us. And the one from the DCCC is just horribly bad. And so I'll have a link to both of those so that you can take a look at that too.
Yeah.
Do we have any other candidates? I know Murray's a candidate. Well, way to go, Murray. That's good. And thank you. You were the one who turned me on to that book. I did order the book and read it. It's very good. We'll have links to the books that Murray mentioned also in the follow-up email.
Where is Murray a candidate?
I'm in Minnesota House District 12A. It's on the far western edge of Minnesota, the little bump in South Dakota that goes into South
Oh,
Dakota.
okay.
Jeff Backer is the person who currently holds the seat. And we have another candidate running here against Tori Westrom too, Carrie Dory from Ortonville. She's an educator as I am. And
Great.
at least until we still don't obviously know the district lines or
Right.
how things are going to play out. But and I might just add about the Randy Olson piece. George and I had a long conversation one day, and I actually called Randy Olson and talked to him. He's a professor at the University of Southern California, and he's talked a lot about and written a lot about stories. And he used the example from Hollywood, how they put things together. And South Park is one, you probably don't maybe not watch it, but he used it as an example of how they put their stories together. And, but, and therefore, and he said, too often, most of us, we just go and we don't add the but, and then the therefore is the better way or the different way to do stuff. And it's very, very interesting, and it helps with creating a story. It's not the only way, but it's does a pretty good job of how you can make your story be heard by others and have an impact. So
Yeah.
that's one of the things I was working on, because I think I 100% agree that the stories are so important, and the values we share is a good way to go about it. Because I'll give you a quick example. We all have families, and the right seems to want to say that they have the control of how you should think of a family, but that's not true, because we all have families, and we can talk to that very same thing. So
Right.
Yeah.
I note here, Gary Moorhead's here from Michigan, Joey from Seattle. We're getting more of a Seattle and more of a Washington contingent. We did some training for the state party there, and it's been very fun to see folks coming in. That's great.
George, where are you and Lisa? Where are you based?
We're just on the northwest corner of Minneapolis. We're in a town called Woodland Park.
Oh, now I have relatives up in Bear Lake area. So
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Thompson's.
We've
Bear
got a
Lake.
Thompson here, but he's from farther north.
I don't even know, where is Bear
Just,
Lake? Is it way
up-
up north or?
It's up
Yeah.
towards McGrath, I think, or not that far up, but I don't know, a couple hours north of Minneapolis, I guess.
Okay. How long were you there?
Well, I only was there for a reunion quite some time ago, but on my grandmother's side, that's where she was born there, and around Bear Lake, there's a
Oh, you froze.
Yeah, Bear Lake is only about oh no, she's in Big Bear. No, Bear Lake. It's not that far from the cities.
Indeed.
It's interesting that a connection was just formed.
No, Bear
From-
Lake's above Minneapolis. White Bear Lake's above St. Paul.
But when you talk about, when you go out of town, let's suppose you're in Minnesota and you go to New York and you find somebody else that used to live in Minnesota, it practically makes you, related in that sense. It is how you think of community and how we identify, if you're a New York Giants fan and happen to run into another New York Giants fan, you get this bonding that goes on, and that's essential to, I think, lowering the bar for having a conversation. And I just was watching that happen and had to jump in to say, that's cool.
Finding common ground.
Where is Bear Lake? Yeah, okay. Let's get out the map of Minnesota and find out.
When I started working in community education, and for those who aren't from Minnesota, community education is the part of the school district that is deals with everything outside of the K-12 education. So it's early childhood, it's adult programs, it's GED, ABE, childcare, after-school programs for kids. So anything that's outside the regular K-12 day is considered is community education in Minnesota. Other states have community education. It's just Minnesota does it that way. And we used to talk a lot about community and what is community. And when you really start to think about it, what is it? And I'm seeing, fast forward, now to 25 years later, we used to talk about community in terms of like your physical location. Like who lives in your school district or who lives in your neighborhood, or who lives in your city or whatever. And now community is really look at us. We're all over, we're all over in the country, and here we are all together talking. And so community is really widening, and it becomes just like whoever you relate to, and like however that is, like Hobie said, oh yeah, we're in a different state, but we're both from Minnesota. We're community, but it is. It's like however it is you relate to somebody, they become your community. And it's go ahead, George.
I was going to say, maybe as a coda on that, some of you may have read Kurt Vonnegut. And so Kurt Vonnegut talks about grand falloons and carouses. And a grand falloon is a group of people who identify together and they have a purpose, like they're Shriners or, they're on a ball team or whatever. And then there are those people who just identify with each other and they don't have any purpose and there's no real group. They just, for some reason, realize that they're in the same group as the other person. And he calls that a carouse. I just thought it was the wildest thing because that's true. You meet people and you go, okay, we're on the same wavelength. I can't tell you why, but we just are. And it's a different way of looking at things. But all that tells me is there's a whole lot of ways to connect with people. And if we find those ways when we're out there talking to voters and making ourselves, making our feelings and beliefs known out there, hey, any way you can connect. Well, we're doing pretty good here. I think everybody, a lot of folks are popping off. We won't keep you all night. I don't know. Did anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks, George and Lisa. It was a really awesome program, and it's really going to help me talk to my son. I got some more. Being a hippie parent, I produced a Republican child, unfortunately, and he wore the suit jacket and the bow tie in kindergarten, and
So is Jeanette.
Yeah, I know, but he's a beautiful man, and I know that because he was born at home and breastfed for so goddamn long. But but during his professional career recently, he had a pretty bad experience, and I know it affected him personally, and I kind of turned him over to the dark side. And I know this by, he'll say something, and I go, oh, and I think I know who he's listening to just by what he said. So I'm just sort of. And I've used those tactics. I don't confront him, but I just try to, present the good examples of people in situations, and he gets it. But thank you so much. I really enjoyed this so much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Joey. We'll hopefully see you next time.
Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely.
Everybody who's left here. Thank you for coming tonight, and we had a great conversation. I always appreciate the input from people. So thank you so much.
Good night. Stay
Bye,
safe.
everybody.
All right, folks. Bye-bye. connectionslab.org